A dash of daring. Maybe like me, you're starting to think, hey, wouldn't it be great to have your own winery? You know, making fabulous wines, your name on labels, hanging out with grapes instead of commuters, living in idyllic neighborhoods instead of cities or suburbs. Oh, and the wine cellar. Ah, but wait a moment. Maybe we should consult the ghost of Gustav Niebaum. He had his own winery, historic Inglenook. A century later, he is still the poster boy for the popular Napa adage, to make a small fortune in the wine business, you have to start with a large fortune. Niebaum poured money into his winery, obsessed with making fabulous wines. But Niebaum was a shipping and trading tycoon. Are you a tycoon? Uh-huh. Well, guess maybe we'll just stick to tasting and touring. By now, you should have a pretty good idea why the Napa River Valley is such a paradise for winemakers. Yet for all its natural ingredients, the rich bottomland, the sedimentary soil, the volcanic residue, the rocks, the clay, the sun, the shade, the water, the fog, the hills, the breezes, For all that, all of Mother Nature's bounty would be for naught, but for a dash of daring, a pinch of personality, and healthy doses of persistence and creativity from generations of winemakers. You see, the final indispensable ingredient of great wine is the human touch. Some call it the science of enology. I call it art. Napa today is full of artists, great winemakers and viticulturists, building on the legacy of pioneers who discovered this American Eden and first turned nature's gifts into wine. They were the leaders of the first golden age of California wine. It started around the time of the U.S. Civil War. German immigrant Charles Krug launched the valley's first large-scale commercial winery. Krug started with that large fortune, mostly his wife's dowry of 540 prime acres near St. Helena. Krug was a beloved figure, but apparently didn't start rich enough. He barely survived one bout of formal bankruptcy. He was, however, a giant among advocates for high-quality wines. Jacob Schramm, another German immigrant, settled in the hills between St. Helena and Calistoga around the same time as Krug. He didn't start with any fortune whatsoever. Schramm was a barber. But in classic great American dream fashion, the simple barber ended up simply rich. His wines became staples at the finest hotels and resorts. Celebrities of the age, like writer Robert Louis Stevenson in 1880, stopped by for tours and tastings. Then came the Beringer boys, the brothers Jacob and Frederick from Mainz, Germany. Jacob worked for Krug and then bought his first 100 acres across the street. The boys' Rheinhaus mansion and winery remain wine country landmarks today. Now, if you're getting an impression of strong German influence on early Napa winemaking, well, then you've been listening. In fact, 1880s Napa was big enough to have 2 German brass bands. A high school drama production of Schiller's Die Räuber was performed entirely in German, and much of its wines were being made in the Rhineland style. Trinken Sie Deutsch? Sorry. And there were other immigrants then. The Finland-born Niebaum was an early disciple of Louis Pasteur and introduced practices and standards of cleanliness well ahead of the times. He was a tyrant about germs and conducted his own surprise white glove inspections. His Inglenook winery became the superstar of that first golden age of California wine. At the Paris Exposition of 1889, that's nearly 90 years before the famous Paris blind tasting of 1976, Inglenook won top honors for excellence and purity. Finally, there was the French cream of tartar man, last of the major winery pioneers in pre-Prohibition Napa Valley, Georges de Latour. He fled to California after his French wine estate was wiped out by a grapevine disease. He tried cream of tartar making, and then he started historic Beaulieu vineyards, which reminds me of one more helpful ingredient in the winemaking process. This became apparent, thanks to Georges, a few years later during Prohibition. Through that long national dry spell, a period that wiped out most Napa wineries, Beaulieu thrived. It turned out that among de Latour's best friends at the time was the Archbishop of San Francisco, and God bless legal loopholes, the church was permitted to order all the sacramental wines it required. So you see, a key ingredient of successful winemaking, just as in so many other endeavors, is having friends in high places. Rutherford dust. Now, welcome to the Rutherford district. If you were a Cabernet Sauvignon grape, you'd buy a condo and retire here. Soil washed down from the hills has accumulated to form a 6-mile-long deposit of nutrient-rich loam, what geologists call an alluvial bench. Cabernet grapes call it heaven. The bench is credited with imparting an earthy quality to the wine here, what's commonly called Rutherford dust. No, vacuum cleaner salesmen need not rush to the scene. We're talking taste here, an inexplicably pleasant one, if you're wondering. It's the unique spice of Rutherford. Napa Valley's international reputation was born here, back in the first Golden Age, before Prohibition. Unfortunately, that reputation needed some polishing in the years right after repeal. Back then, de la Tour's first shipment east was a disaster. Fermentation run amok, barrels of rotten wine. But riding to the rescue in Rutherford was the lone Russian. Andrei Chelychev was a wine chemist studying in Paris when de la Tour brought him over to investigate what was wrong with his Napa winery. Well, what Andrei found took his breath away. I mean, literally, the man could not breathe. The antiquated wine vats were germ factories. Clouds of carbon dioxide wafted from open fermentation tanks, intoxicating mice and birds who did many a fine belly flop into the new vintage. Delightful. Hints of oak, berries, and the mouse toes. The Russian promptly transformed de la Tour's primitive winery operation with modern equipment and sanitary standards. Almost overnight, de la Tour was back in the premium wine business. 2 years after that disastrous East Coast shipment of rotten wine, de la Tour's renovated Beaulieu vineyards won the grand prize with its Burgundy at the Golden State Exposition of 1939. And the lone Russian was on his way to Napa Valley stardom. Today, Andrei Chelychev is regarded as perhaps the greatest winemaker in American history. Past and future now share the spotlight in this rich region. Nowhere is that more apparent than here, along Highway 29. On one side of the road is Beaulieu Vineyards. De la Tour and Andrei Chelychev are gone, but their winery is still a sparkling gem, producing top-rated premium wines. Samples can be tasted in the 2-level Visitors Center or in the Georges de la Tour Reserve Room. Across the highway, Hollywood legend Francis Ford Coppola and his wife Eleanor have brought new splendor and grace to Gustav Niebaum's old Inglenook winery. The grounds of the Niebaum Coppola Estates winery are reminiscent of the Luxembourg Gardens of Paris. Young visitors can sail wooden boats in the Great Fountain, and the tasting rooms offer the ultimate sanctuary in the event of apocalypse now or later. Another of the legendary figures of Napa is known along the highway for his black beret and his great wines. Croatian immigrant Miljenko Grgic, friends call him Mike, is the winemaker half of the Grgic Hills winery team. He worked for Beaulieu and Mondavi before he and his beret took up residence 30 years ago at Chateau Montelena. It was Mike's Chardonnay, crushed his first year at the Calistoga winery, that won the Paris tasting for white wines in 1976. Grgic has since teamed with Austin Hills of the Hills Brothers coffee family to make this Rutherford winery one of Napa's premier producers. And next time you vacation in the Balkans, be sure to find Mike's latest winery in the Croatian wine country. Unfortunately, our Dalmatian Coast CD-ROM is not yet available. But other Rutherford wineries to consider include the Raymond Vineyard and Cellar on Zinfandel Lane, operated by a family descended from the Beringer brothers, St. Superi Vineyard and Winery on Highway 29, which offers tastings and winery exhibits. A mini science museum features a smell station that helps demonstrate elements of wine bouquet. Cakebread Cellars on the highway makes a range of premium wines, but recently released something new, something blue. A Chardonnay Sauvignon Blanc blend they call Deep Blue, intended to accompany foods from the Deep Blue Sea. Franciscan Vineyards on the highway at Galeron Road is the home of 4 labels, including Mount Veeder. Some afternoon tastings offer visitors a chance to blend their own wines. And there's Mum Napa Valley on Silverado Trail, another fine French champagne maker. Did I mention I break for bubbles? Prohibition and Other Pests. For all its friends, wine does have a few notable enemies. Take Jack Frost, for instance, a dangerous mugger and thief in the night. Those big Frost fans you find around the valley, the ones that look like propellers from World War II fighter planes, only without the planes, they keep the air moving to fight back Jack. And then there are the various insidious sneaks, black rot, root rot, and gray rot, the latter capable of showing an occasional sweet disposition that earns it the nickname noble rot. Phylloxera was devastating a century ago. It's still trouble, a little yellow aphid with a bad attitude and a mean appetite. It's a particularly ugly American to Europeans, who regard it as a sinister force akin to the Black Plague in spring colors. But it also menaces American vineyards. There are also mites, blights, birds, and rodents. You dirty rats. But the latest, biggest menace to the vineyards, let me see, it's right here, it's in this report. Next page. Yes. The biggest menace to California grape growers today is Pierce's disease. Pierce's disease? What's that about? Wait, Pierce's disease is caused by a bacterium native to the American Southeast. Well, at least it's not a virus. Bacterium Xylella fastidiosa. Xylella fastidiosa. Well, at least it's neat. How bad can that be? The bacterium, which clogs the water-conducting tissue of a plant and ultimately causes it to dry up and wither away. But that's terrible. How can that happen? It's spread by insects known as sharpshooters, including the glassy-winged sharpshooter. Well, that's interesting. That's not exactly what I meant. My question is, how can they name the pest Pierce, is the question. Oh, well. When it comes to enemies of wine, all pests are but gnats compared to the big killer, Prohibition. It closed down more American wineries and vineyards than any bug. Ironically, some of the earliest American winemakers were also active in the temperance movement. Remember the Cincinnati wine country? It was developed by a temperance backer who saw wine as a moderate alternative to hard liquor. Unfortunately, when the temperance axe finally fell on saloons and rum makers in 1920, it fell just as swiftly and surely on the winemakers. Oh, a few tried bootlegging. One got away with shipping wine jugs in coffins. But the broader market dried up. Premium winemaking was dead. In the Napa Valley, grape growers tore up their old vines and replaced them with fruit trees. Plums, mostly. Had Prohibition lingered, I might be leading you on a tour of the California prune country. Of course, that would require a few extra pit stops. Oh, let's keep moving. After 13 years of Prohibition, winemakers were legal again, just in time for the Great Depression. Much of their initial wine production was cheap, fortified, high alcohol, well, it got the reputation of Skid Row swill. Enter a new generation of Napa pioneers. The Mondavi family of Cesare and Rosa started the sunny St. Helena winery and then restored Charles Krug. Louis M. Martini brought his family north from the San Joaquin Valley. John Daniel Jr. took over winemaking at Inglenook, and Andrei Chelichev, the Russian, landed in Beaulieu vineyards. Call them heroes of the post-Prohibition era, maybe even saviors. Resurrection of Napa Valley wine's reputation can be traced directly back to their quality winemaking efforts. It was bud break for the second golden age of California wine, and it came after a virtual ice age of hard times. Which, come to think of it, makes that little vine ailment Pierce thing rather pale by comparison, don't you think? Okay, I'm a little sensitive. Turns out they named Pierce disease after some entomologist with the Department of Agriculture. He was no relation. It's too bad he didn't get the Nobel Prize instead. I mean, I just don't see why it's such a tribute, having a vine disease named after you. And besides, it's carried by that sharpshooter bug. I think you could almost change it to the Wyatt Earp disease. He was a sharpshooter. Or, Annie Oakley, it could be. John Wayne's disease. Buffalo Bill, Charlton Heston's disease. Could be William Tell. Crazy for St. Helena. Back when the South was trying to secede from the Union, central air conditioning wasn't even on the drawing boards. Early winemakers had to look for other ways to keep their wine-aging chambers cool, Fahrenheit 58 preferably. Here in St. Helena, that sometimes required winemakers to move mountains. Well, at least rearrange them a little. Take the hills around Beringer Winery on Main Street. Jacob, the first Beringer boy in town back in the 1860s, did some of the earliest interior decorating, excavating 1,000 feet of tunnels through the limestone and volcanic rock. And Beringer became one of the biggest names in California winemaking, even before phones were invented to call the air conditioning repairman. Beringer is the oldest continuously operating winery in the valley, thanks to those church accounts that kept the wine flowing through Prohibition. And it's one of the prime tourist attractions of the wine country. The elegant Rhine House includes a tasting room for reserve wines. The old bottling room also provides tastings, served up with plenty of wine history. An old bottle of that blessed church wine is also there on display. On the same street, a short distance away, is another St. Helena landmark, the oldest winery in Napa Valley. Charles Krug Winery has been part of the Mondavi family winemaking operation since the Allies and the Axis squared off more than 60 years ago. Remember, the brothers Mondavi did the same thing in the 1960s. It was little brother Peter Mondavi who ended up running this one. And let me say, as a baby brother myself, it's great to see the kid make good. At the old stone Krug plant, wine still is aged in massive 80-year-old redwood tanks. Not far down Main Street is the winery where the Mondavi clan got its Napa Valley start. Originally it was called Sunny St. Helena Winery. Today it is Maryvale Vineyards. The wood-walled tasting room is warm and cabin-like. The Louis Martini Winery on Highway 29 is the original home of another of the most influential post-war families, the Martinis. Hold the olives, they're not related to the cocktail. The winery is plain, but the range of wines extensive, the atmosphere friendly, and the quality as high as always. Freemark Abbey on Highway 29 occupies the site of Joe's Winery. Joe? Ah, it was the widow Josephine Marlin Tixon, first woman to build and operate a California winery back in 1886. Well, of course, everyone knows guys are suckers for a dame with a winery. Other wineries in the area are also making names for themselves. One is Height's Wine Cellars. The tasting room is in an elegant River Rock building on Highway 29, surrounded by vineyards. It's best known for Cabernet Sauvignon grown at Martha's Vineyard. No, not off Nantucket, nearby Oakville. Also along this stretch of Highway 29 is St. Clement Vineyards with its gabled Victorian Visitors Center. Tastings are in the parlor. St. Clement's stands at the base of Spring Mountain, another of the grape-growing regions of Napa Valley. A side trip up the mountain winds through hillside vineyards offering nice vistas. Most Spring Mountain wineries are open only by appointment. An inviting exception is the Robert Keenan Winery. It's on the site of a 1904 winery. The tasting room is a wood loft overlooking stainless steel tanks and oak barrels producing Merlot and Cabernet. Back in town, one of the most handsome landmarks of 19th century winemaking is Greystone, more recently the home of Christian Brothers. Today, the old stone castle is home of the Culinary Institute of America. Its Wine Spectator restaurant is among the best in the valley. But St. Helena has other gourmet gems too. Trevina on Charter Oak Avenue, Terra on Railroad Avenue, and Pinot Blanc on Main Street are just a sampling. But now, let's analyze this. The small winery outside St. Helena on Highway 29, the one with the French name, Folie à Deux, meaning, what, shared craziness? Well, it's the label. Tell me what you see on the label. Isn't that a portrait of Freud? No. Is that my mother? Am I insane? No. Oh, it's a Rorschach ink blot. I knew that. Folie à Deux was founded a few years ago by mental health professionals. And why not? If actors can portray psychiatrists, why can't psychologists act like winemakers? Unfortunately, the answer lies in bankruptcy court. The psychologists eventually lost their winery. Fortunately, the new owners preserved the ink blot label, which, on second glance, maybe it looks more like a bug on a windshield. And they saved the winery name. It's still Folie à Deux, still crazy after all these years, making it a particularly appropriate stop for those crazy about sampling good wine. Terroir. Wine, as you may have discovered by now, is a many-flavored thing. For reasons I wish I could explain, a sip of Cabernet Sauvignon can impart hints of currant, plum, black cherry, cedar, mint, anise, olive, even tobacco. And fellow red, Zinfandel, it tends to cherry, black pepper, and oak tones. A Merlot can add hints of chocolate. On the white side, a complex Chardonnay evokes intense fruit flavors like apple, fig, lemon, melon, pear, and pineapple, as well as honey, vanilla, butter, and butterscotch. What's going on here? Throw in some tannin, that's an underlying bitterness or slight pucker maker from the grape skin, and you can understand why our tongues approach a sip of wine like children at the gates to Disneyland. Of course, many things affect the taste of any wine, starting with the grapes themselves. Then there are these: the duration of fermentation and aging, how long the juices sit on their tailings, or dregs. The winemaker calls it their lees. And the origins of wine barrels. You may think one oak barrel is like another, but American oaks impart more vanilla than the Europeans. Moreover, when barrel wood is fired or toasted, it can add a coffee tinge, or, if taken too far, the essence of charcoal briquettes. Finally, flavor is affected by the timing of virtually everything, from the hour of harvest to the time in a bottle. All are factors of the basic style and artistry of the winemaker. But there's one more factor. It's the taste of Rutherford as distinct from Mount Vider, for instance. The French call it terroir. No, not terror, nothing to fear here. It's terroir. Territory, translated literally. But in winemaking, it means dirt, really. Burgundy dirt, Loire Valley dirt, Rhone Valley dirt. In California, terroir has broader meaning. Here we think of terroir as the partnership of geology and weather, the teamwork of soil, topography, microclimate, and sun exposure. Sometimes differentiating one terroir from another means measuring the precise mix of clay and volcanic ash in the fields, calibrating the exact degree of a sloped hillside, or the vineyard's orientation to the sun, or tracking if the fog recedes by 8:37 a.m. or 9:17. All are elements that can affect the wine. But terroir is more. Ultimately, it is the essence of place. A glass of Napa Valley wine expresses the sun of California, but also the daring of its pioneers. It expresses the valley's soil, volcanoes, and rivers, but also the flair of its winemakers. Terroir is, as someone once said, the wine's statement of somewhere-ness. So the next time you feel like you're nowhere, pull out that corkscrew and let the terroir transport you back to the Napa Valley. Just remember, bring me along. Water to wine, Calistoga. In Calistoga, the northernmost grape-growing region of Napa Valley, wine shares the stage with water. Great geysers of water, natural springs of water, even bottled water. Actually, that reminds me of home. I'm from Saratoga Springs, New York. It's a great old town. I probably had my first glass of wine there. Yes, I think, well, it's not the point. Oh, and the potato chip was invented there. That's not the point either. What was I saying? Oh, Saratoga had lots of water too. Mineral springs and hot baths made Saratoga famous. So, when natural springs were discovered here, local entrepreneurs saw visions of Saratoga. California's first millionaire, Sam Brannan, was a local visionary. He jumped at a chance to create Saratoga West. As the story goes, Old Sam rose before a public gathering to announce his grand plan. Unfortunately, his celebration had already begun, and he wasn't toasting the moment with water. So it was that Sam Brannan stood and declared that day, "I'm going to make this the Calistoga of California." And the name stuck. It's been Calistoga ever since. honest. Well, speaking of things sticking, no visit to Calistoga is complete without a relaxing dip in the hot mud. Don't worry, it comes with showers and optional massage. Just follow the spa signs downtown along Lincoln Avenue, or, for more elegant treatment, look for spa resorts like Meadowood in nearby St. Helena or Auberge du Soleil in Rutherford. If it was water that first put Calistoga on the map, wine brought it special fame. This is the home of Chateau Montelena on Tubbs Lane, a winner of the famous Paris Taste Test in 1976. Unfortunately, if you want to see that winning Chardonnay, you'll have to make a U-turn soon and gas up for a 2,500-mile trip. A bottle of that 1973 vintage is on display in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Institution. But before you go, the winery itself is worth a visit. A magnificent stone castle, lush grounds, a lovely lake, and a tasting room full of, Chateau Montelena wines. On second thought, let's leave Washington to the politicians. Sterling Vineyards on Dunawheel Lane is an international delight. The tour starts with an aerial tram to the hilltop winery that is vintage Switzerland. The grand white complex atop the knoll is in the style of a Greek monastery. The bell that tolls every half hour was salvaged from a London church destroyed during World War II, and the wine, it's all California. Also on Dunawheel Lane is the winery Clos Pegase, named after the winged horse of Greek mythology. And like the Greeks of ancient times, Clos Pegase now offers the modern world both wine and art. 17th and 18th century French statuary on display in the winery's Great Aging Cave. At the winery of the Brothers Grimm on Highway 128, yes, it's the Storybook Mountain Vineyards, there are no trolls, no big bad wolves, no enchanted frogs, and I'm sorry to say, no fairy princesses. But on this site, where German brothers named Jacob and Adam Grimm made wine more than a century ago, you can sample the new house specialty, an enchanting Zinfandel. The Hans Faden Vineyards and Winery on Petrified Forest Road is in the Mayacamas Hills above town, an idyllic place to sample wines, hike, fly fish from an inner tube, dine in a cave, or tour a vinegar plant. This is one of the Napa vineyards that went through a bout of plum planting during Prohibition. Thank goodness it recovered. Historic Schramsberg is just outside of town off Highway 29 on Schramsberg Road, one of the most important sites in the neighborhood. Here's how Robert Louis Stevenson described it back in 1880 after his tour with old Jacob, the barber winemaker. The picture of prosperity. Cellars far dug into the hillside and resting on pillars like a bandit's cave. All trimness, varnish, flowers, and sunshine among the tangled wildwood. All right, so the writer was in a good mood. It was his honeymoon after all, and Jacob Schramm's wine didn't hurt. Unfortunately, Prohibition took its toll and the estate fell into disrepair until the Davies family moved in from Los Angeles. They were pioneers of the second golden age of California wine, the one we're basking in at this very moment. In 1972, it was a Schramsberg Blanc de Blanc that President Nixon served in Beijing for his historic toast to world peace with Chinese Premier Chow En-lai. Decades later, world peace remains elusive, but Schramsberg continues to make some of the world's finest sparkling wines. Now let's turn south along the other highway, a road less traveled, the beautiful Silverado Trail out of Calistoga. Cuvée Winery on the trail invites visitors to taste wines aged in French oak barrels, or to just relax on the grounds in the shade of their aged California oaks. At Dutch Henry Winery, the tasting samples come right from the barrels. The small operation is a low-key family affair known for Pinot Noirs and friendly dogs. Puppies and Pinots, oh my, I may never leave. Beyond words and labels. Before we talk about wine labels, let's agree on one thing. Words cannot do justice to a great wine, but they can try to make dog saliva sound grand. So, know your labels. Back in the old days, wine bottles didn't have labels. Everything the winemaker thought you should know showed through the bottle, red or white. But now, so many words and names and dates and places. Sometimes it's like the credits after a movie. You have to wonder, what do all those assistant, associate, executive producers do? Wine labels can be just as confusing, but let's take it an element at a time. First, the name of the winery. That is usually the best clue to the quality of what's inside the bottle. Next, the grapes. Now you know the varietals like Cabernet Sauvignon or Pinot Noir, but if the label just says red table wine, the bottle contains a blend. None of the varietals is dominant, at least not enough for top billing. By federal law, it can't claim to be a Merlot, for instance, unless Merlot grapes make up at least 75% of that blend. Check the back label for a list of the supporting grapes and their roles. Some wine blends may have fine ensemble casts with players that fall just short of the 75% starring level. Some of those are showing up labeled Meritage, proof that a marketing gimmick can also taste very nice. Next, look for the appellation. It will say Napa Valley if at least 75% of the grapes grew somewhere out there along our tour route. If it says Rutherford or Oakville or Stag's Leap, a tougher formula, 85% of the grapes had to be grown on vines within those regions. If the label says simply California, well, you can be sure the grapes weren't trucked in from Arkansas. Now, sometimes a vineyard is named on the label, and that's like Frank Sinatra listing hometown Hoboken on his album cover. Here it means all the grapes in the wine came from that vineyard, not from Hoboken. Estate bottled? That means the winery controls the vineyards used in that bottle, and the winery did all the work. Crushing, fermenting, bottling, silver polishing, window washing, bed making. Well, you know, there's lots of work to do on an estate. Raking. And the last important indicator is vintage date. That's the year of the fall crush. Now, here's where the terms start getting a little squishy. Reserve, or private reserve, used to stand for the winery's best wines. No more. Sometimes it indicates high quality, sometimes not. When in doubt, rely on the winery's reputation. Words like classic or limited release or special are marketing terms that tell you nothing about where the wine came from or how it was made. Clearly, labels are an important part of wine marketing, but it's not all hype and salesmanship. Sometimes it's art. Francis Ford Coppola took special care selecting his first label. He asked Tiffany's to design it. They balked. "We don't do labels, sir." Coppola suggested that they think of it more as an invitation, like an invitation for a bar mitzvah or for a wedding. Ah, that worked. And when you think about it, that's exactly what a label is. The winemaker's invitation to try something beyond the reach of mere words. Apostrophe yes, Stag's Leap. Finally, returning to southern Napa Valley down along the Silverado Trail brings us back to Paris. Well, of course, it was Paris that put this region on the map. Remember, the 1976 Paris Taste Test honored Stag's Leap wine cellars for its magnifique Cabernet Sauvignon. Overnight, Stag's Leap was the toast of the international wine world. Everyone was talking Stag's Leap. The pilgrimage of world wine writers began. There was something in the air of Stag's Leap, or in its red volcanic soil, or in its weather or water or western exposure. Critics raved about it. One said the area was Earth's very own erogenous zone, producing wines with the irresistible softness of flannel pajamas. Well, all that great publicity made it highly advantageous for any wine bottle to have Stag's Leap on its label. So what followed, much as hangovers bring headaches, was a legal siege. Lawyers multiplied like summer gnats. The issue was whether the Paris winner, Stag's Leap Cellars, owned the name it made famous, at least the venison portion. The courts had to mediate what finally came down to a punctuation spat. There was Stag's S' Leap Cellars, and Stag's S' Leap Winery. Stay with me now. The press immediately dubbed it the Apostrophe War. It was all worked out as Stag's Leap District became an official Napa Valley sub-appellation. Now, everyone in the region may use Stag's Leap on labels, with or without that pesky apostrophe. The Stag's Leap region's reputation still soars today. Most famous among area labels remains Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, the S' Victor from Paris. Its simple tasting room is tucked away among the huge wine casks. Back up Silverado Trail, Stag's Leap Winery also is open for tours and tastings, but by appointment on weekends. There are other wineries of note too along the Silverado Trail. Clos Duval, where French winemakers follow tradition down to planting roses at the ends of vine rows. Chimney Rock, a golf course bought by a former Pepsi executive who replaced 9 holes with vines. He might have plowed under more fairways, but the golf lover drew a line in the sand trap. Silverado Winery. It's owned by the Disney family, a sleepy beauty with great views and terrific wines. And the Ragushi Winery, site of one of the valley's best preserved ghost wineries. Today, the long-abandoned Grigsby Place, built in 1868, is possessed by the Ragushi family, and it's haunted only by aging Ragushi wines. It's open by appointment, if you dare. Final scenes, the city of Napa. We return now to the riverfront town of Napa. It was founded more than 150 years ago by a troublemaker, Nathan Coombs. He would later become a leading figure of the Bear Flag Rebellion that made California independent of Mexico. In the days before wine exports, the town of Napa supplied gear and grub to gold prospectors, the original 49ers who rushed to California from all over the world. Today, Old Nate's Town still serves a rush of international visitors, the tourists attracted by a motherlode of great wines. Fortunately, much of its 19th century charm remains, notably in the historic downtown district, the Coppola-restored 1879 Opera House, the public murals depicting the town's colorful past, the walking tours showing off beautiful old Victorian neighborhoods. Indeed, though we've circumnavigated Napa the Valley, you should know that Napa the town still offers a few more surprises, more sights, more sounds, more places to explore, more shops, restaurants, galleries, and sake. Sake? Yes, Hakusan Sake Gardens on Executive Way. It offers tastings and tours amidst the serenity of rock gardens. Well, we've learned a lot about grapes. Here's our chance to get to know rice. But there's more about wine here, too. Take Copia, the American Center for Wine, Food, and the Arts. It celebrates the grape. Copia's 12-acre riverfront site on First Street is a park, theater, and cultural center, with offerings like how to start a wine cellar or the history of food. I wonder if they know that the potato chip was invented back home in Saratoga Springs. Finally, if your sniffer isn't on overload, you might want to try the RMS Brandy Distillery on Cuttings Wharf Road. Sniffing only, no tasting. California state law prohibits brandy tastings, but oh, what a treat for the nose. Before completing our tour, a note about other outlying wine regions. We couldn't visit all of them. I mentioned Spring Mountain earlier, but another region up north is Diamond Mountain. Some of the newest Napa wine-producing areas actually lie outside the valley proper. To the east, they include Howell Mountain, Childs Valley, and Atlas Peak. And further south, Wild Horse Valley. Tours and tastings at those wineries generally require advance reservations, but can be well worth the extra effort to seek out and sample. course, we've barely mentioned Sonoma, Napa's sister valley to the west. Rumor has it that lovely Sonoma is loaded with winemakers and wine stories. Ooh, you know what that means. One of the most exciting words in Hollywood. Sequel. I see my time's about up, but don't rush off on my account. Stay, linger, enjoy. There are so many more wineries to explore along the byways and backroads of Napa Valley, so many places to discover. So take your time. Savor the wines, savor the wine country. Until we're on the road again, here's hoping the pleasure of this tour lingers like the finish of a fine wine. May it also add to your appreciation of the character and the characters behind your next glass of Napa Valley wine. Now, a parting toast to good taste and good tastings, to the taste of Napa.